Hey everyone, Vague here, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through how to create some typical Chrometype style artwork like this in Blender. So I'll start off by taking you through how to do this in the simplest method, before then taking it a step further and using curves to create our type, which will allow us to fully customize the shape of it, as well as add in effects like twisting animations and more. I'll then quickly go over how you can achieve a range of different aesthetics with your design by experimenting with colour and composition, before then taking our artwork into Photoshop and converting it into mediums such as poster designs and album artwork. So first things first, we'll want to start off by coming up with some ideas for what we're looking to create. So personally, my favourite place to gather inspiration for this particular genre is, would you believe it, a page simply titled Chrometype on Instagram here. So these guys post an amazing array of content that all falls under the wide umbrella that is the Chrometype genre. But as you can see, there's an awesome variety of stuff that really acts as a great place to start when you're looking for direction on what to create next. So then once I get past the initial overwhelmment of amazing work, I then try to boil it down to a few ideas on what it is I want to explore in my design, and then begin making some sketches like so. Now, I prefer to do this initial stage manually by hand, but feel free to use whatever medium you feel comfortable in here, whether that be digital or analog. Then, once we've finished sketching our designs, we'll scan it in or take a photo of it so we can use it as a reference in Blender. Then we'll head over into Blender and open up a new project. I'm then going to go up here under our add rollout, and under the curve options select Bezier. Now, before we start editing our curve, we're going to want to bring in our scanned image so we can use this as a reference to trace over. So to do this, we'll first want to position ourselves in the top orthographic viewing mode here by pressing this blue Z icon on our gimbal. From here, we can again go up to our add rollout, and this time under the image option, select Reference. We'll then just select our image file and load it in. We'll then want to roughly position our curve on top of our chosen design by using the Move shortcut G, before then hitting Tab, which will take us into edit mode. From here, we can then further adjust the control point's position, rotation, and scale using their respective shortcuts G, R, and S. We can then work our way around the rest of the shape by adding in new control points to the curve as we go, using the Extrude Point shortcut E. Then, when we're ready to close out our curve, simply select the 2 points we wish to join and press F. I then went ahead and adjusted these handles until I was getting a nice sharp edge like so. We'll then repeat this process for all of our individual letters or shapes by adding in new Bezier curve objects and then adjusting them to fit. And you can also use external programs here like Illustrator to trace the curves if you feel more comfortable in them, and then import them to Blender as an SVG file. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I just wanted to demonstrate how this could purely be done using the default tools in Blender. Another alternative you could also look at here is creating a text object as a base from which we can then distort and manipulate further using the proportional editing mode. Now, this method doesn't allow for quite the same level of flexibility and sort of restricts you somewhat to the font you use, but if you are interested in checking it out, I went over this in my last Chrometype video, which I'll link here. So then once we've finished tracing over our design, what we want to do is select all our individual curve objects and then hit Ctrl J to join them all into one singular curve. And the reason I'm doing this is because what we're actually going to do is convert our curve into a mesh from which we can then fill in and extrude from. And because I'm just going to extrude them all at the same height in a uniform direction, there's no need for us to have them as separate objects. So with that done, we'll now want to increase the resolution of our curve so that we're getting a nice smooth result on the edges here before we begin extruding this upwards. So to do this, let's come across to our Curve Properties tab and increase the resolution to something like 100. We can then convert this to a mesh by hitting F3 to bring up our search dialog and then searching for the Mesh from Curve Surf Text command and selecting it. And what we can see this has now done if we jump into edit mode is, it's converted all our original curve information into mesh data. So it's taken all our original Bezier handles that we had and subdivided them down into mesh vertices like so. And the reason that this is important is that now because we have mesh vertices, what we can do is turn them into closed mesh faces. So the simplest method to do this is by simply selecting all our vertices using the shortcut A, and then use the Create Faces shortcut, which is F. And now if we swap into Faces mode by pressing 3, we can then extrude our faces by again using the shortcut E. And what that should give us now is a pretty simple blocked out version of our original design. So from here, we can really take this in a number of directions depending on the style we're looking to achieve. But what I'll demonstrate next is how we can begin to go about smoothing the hardness of some of these edges, as you'll find most designs in this Chrometype genre use a lot of beveling or rounding on the type edges here. So we can achieve this effect in a few ways. The first of which being the most simple, which is to just select our outer edges pressing Alt-click, and then use the bevel tool by hitting Ctrl-B. From here, we can control the resolution or smoothness of our bevel by scrolling up and down on our mouse wheel like so. Now, the only problem with this method is it tends not to work so great on meshes that have sharp edges and intersections like in my case. So what'll end up happening is once our bevel thickness starts to become wider than some of our mesh faces, we'll get these really wild results. So in order to work around this, we'll use the second method, which is smoothing it using Blender's sculpting mode. But in order for sculpting mode to work properly, what we'll first want to do is rebuild our mesh using the remesh modifier so we can get a nice clean high resolution base object. So I'm just going to set the remesh mode here to voxel, and then we want to lower our voxel size until we're getting a relatively smooth result, which in my case is about 0.01. And then apply. And now you can see if we go into edit mode that we've got thousands of subdivided faces making up our mesh, which is exactly what we want. And then we can just delete any of these off-cut islands that may have resulted in the conversion process. So now with that done, we can come across into the sculpting tab here and select the smooth tool. We can then adjust the radius and strength to our liking, before proceeding to work our way around the edges of our mesh until we end up with this more rounded look. And then once we've done that, we can also start to play around with some of the other tools here. So another one I like to use is the Draw Sharp tool. And what this tool is going to allow us to do is to create something similar to this effect here you commonly see in Chrometype, which is basically just adding in these kind of chiseled razor edges here in the center of our type. So with that selected, we'll make sure the direction is set to add, and then we can simply switch into our top view and begin drawing these center lines roughly following the curvature of our type. Then with that done, I selected the smooth tool again and just melted down these protrusions a bit just to make them a bit less harsh, but it's totally up to you here depending on the aesthetic you're going for. So I just flattened mine out even more by scaling it in the Z direction, and then I was pretty happy with it. Then we can just add the signature chrome effect to our design by creating a new material for it here in the shader editor, which we can then adjust by sliding the metallic slider all the way up to 1, before then dragging our roughness right down to about 0.1 so it's nice and shiny. So at this point, we could then move on to the lighting and rendering stage if we're ready, but I'm actually going to finesse my design a bit further with the new technique, as I really want to exaggerate this sort of overlapping, twisting razor effect I was trying to achieve in some of my sketches. So in order to get this more complex look, what we're first going to do is again start off by drawing a series of base Bezier curves. But this time, instead of tracing them around the outline, what we're going to do is roughly build them along the middle of our type, similarly to what we did with the sharp edges in sculpt mode. And the reason we're doing this is basically what these Bezier curves are going to act as are the guide rails for us to extrude or sweep any shape we want along them. So this is going to allow us much greater control over the width and bevel of all parts of our design. So to demonstrate, now that I have my first base rail curve here, what I can do is come across into my object properties, and then under the geometry tab, you'll see we get this handy little option here called bevel. And you'll see that once I start increasing the depth value, we'll begin to get a circular extrusion forming around our curve. And the great thing about this is that it will adapt and change to whatever we do to our curve. So if I jump back into edit mode here and start moving some of these points around, we'll see it updating nicely alongside it. And further to that, we can also begin adjusting the scale of the extrusion at each point by adjusting this radius slider here. So this is really going to allow us to start controlling exactly where we want our type to be more curvy and wide versus where we want it to be tight and sharp, like so. So then where this technique gets really cool, if you didn't think it was great already, is that rather than this just being a circular pipe the whole way around, what we can actually do is set this extrusion shape to a custom curve. So if I just add in a new Bezier curve here, and then rename it to something like profile curve, what I can then do is go back into the bevel properties of our original curve, and then under this object option, set it to our profile curve. And now you'll see we're getting that show up as our extrusion object instead. And then we can just scale this down a bit if we need to so that it fits a bit better. And so now that we're starting to get a better idea for the overall form of our design, another useful technique we can begin to use is moving some of these points in the Z axis by using the shortcut G and then Z. So this will get rid of any intersections we might be getting in our extrusion, and will start to give us that overlapping, underlapping effect. And the great thing about this is that it won't really change how our original design looks from top view. So it will only be noticeable once we start to look around it in 3D, which gives us a lot of versatility when it comes to rendering time, as we can choose whether we want to represent it in a more of a 3D fashion or stick to that original 2D top view we had in our sketches. And then another great tool we can use is the tilt option here, which you can think of as being like the rotation for our extrusion shape along our rail curve. So this is really what's going to give it that sort of twisting look the more we increase this value from 0 degrees. Then I'm just going to give our object the same chrome material we created earlier. And then if you're wondering what this start and end option is here down in our bevel properties, what this will actually do is control the start and the end point for our extrusion. So in my case, I just want to leave these at 0 and 1 because I want it to cover the entirety of my curve. But this can actually be a really awesome tool for creating path animations once we're finished. So to give you a quick example of this, if we just go to the beginning of our timeline and then set this start value to 1 and give it a keyframe by pressing I, we can then skip forward in our timeline and do the same thing, but this time setting our value to 0. You can now see when we hit play that we get a nice little animation. So continuing on, I just proceeded to work my way through the rest of the letters and shapes using the same process of adding in Bezier curves and giving them the same bevel object. And then once we've finished all our shapes and are happy with the overall design, we're ready to move on to the lighting and rendering stage. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up our render view. So I'll just add in a camera object, and then what I like to do is open up a new viewport here and set this to our camera view by pressing 0. And then I'm just going to set its position here on top of our design looking down. And now if we swap into rendered mode, we'll see we're not getting any lighting showing up. So to fix this, we'll go into our shader editor and change into world mode, before then adding in an environment texture and setting this to an HDRI of our liking. So then the next thing we'll want for our render is a backdrop for it to sit on. So the way I prefer to set this up is to just add in a plane like so. And then for the color of my backdrop, I want it to be a simple gradient. So we can do this by creating a new material and then assigning a color ramp node to the base color input of our principled BSDF. We can then position the scale and location of the gradient by adding mapping and texture coordinate nodes. Now the next thing I want to show you guys is another great tool we can utilize to really take our designs to the next level, and that is the curve modifier. So the curve modifier works in a similar fashion to our bevel modifier which we used for our type, except this time we can actually get our curve to deform an entire custom object of our choosing. So to demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is first import the object I want to deform, which in my case is this barbed wire OBJ. And then what I'm going to do is draw in a new Bezier curve which is going to act as the target for our barbed wire to deform to. Then once we've done that, we can simply select on our barbed wire object and then come across into our modifiers tab and select this one here labeled curve. Then all we have to do is set this curve object here to our Bezier curve and select the correct deform axis. And if your object still isn't deforming correctly here, what you want to do is hit Ctrl A on your Bezier curve and apply all transforms like so. And now we can see, just like for our type curves, we can now move this Bezier curve around like so, and our barbed wire will update automatically. And then we can use all the same adjustment features here to control the twist, radius, and position at different points. And so what I'm actually going to do here is add in some keyframes at 0 and 360 degrees of our tilt parameter, so we'll get a nice twisting effect on our barbed wire. So just work your way around each control point of the deform curve, adding these in at the start and end of our timeline, like so. And now you can see if we hit play, we're getting this really awesome twisting effect with our barbed wire. So yeah, feel free to let your creative juices fly, as you can really use any object you want here to fit the particular aesthetic you're going for and add some simple deformations and animations to it. And if you do want to use this barbed wire asset I'm using here, it'll be included in my Chrometype starter package, which I'll link in the description below to my Gumroad. And this pack will also contain all the finished project files as well as the poster templates and fonts we'll be using later on in the video. So feel free to give it a download if you're someone who's looking to get more into creating this type of work. But anyway, continuing on, I then wanted to match this twisting effect on my type as well. So I just went into each of the curves and repeated this process of adding in keyframes for the tilt parameter at 0 and 360 degrees. And then at this stage, I was really starting to get close to the final render, as I was happy with the overall animation and composition of my design. But there was just one last touch I wanted to add, which was to give my chrome material a bit of iridescence. So if you're wondering what iridescence is, it's this effect commonly seen in Chrometype artwork, which is basically these coloured rainbow-like refractions we get depending on our angle of view. So the best way I've found to achieve this effect is to start off by adding in a colour ramp with a full rainbow spectrum of colours, before then adding in a layer weight, noise texture, and mix RGB nodes and plugging them in like so. And now if we plug this setup into the base colour of our principled BSDF, we'll begin to see how our colours are displaying. And then if we come here into our noise node and start playing around with the scale and distortion parameters, we'll be able to adjust it more to our liking. Then I'm going to add in another mix RGB node in between our colour ramp and BSDF, just so these start to blend into each other a bit more. And then next what we'll want to do is start to add in a bit of randomness into where these colours show up, as I don't want them to display uniformly across my whole design like it's currently doing. So to do this, we'll first add in a mix shader and then duplicate our principled BSDF using Shift D. We'll then plug them in like so, before then creating a new noise texture, which we'll plug into a black and white colour ramp. So what this is going to do is act as the alpha for our mix shader. So to demonstrate what I mean by that, if I just plug our noise setup into the material output like so, we'll see all we're getting is this black and white result. And basically what these black and white values will tell our mix shader is where to show one material versus the other. So if we were to then go ahead and now plug these into the factor of our mix shader, we'll see that now shows up as intended. Then we can just play with the sliders on our colour ramp and noise nodes until we get the iridescence to our liking. So now we're pretty much ready to render out our final animation. But just before I do this, what I'm going to do is come across to our compositing tab so we can add a few subtle post effects that'll add the final polish to our render. So the first thing we'll want to do is just check this Use Nodes box here. And then I'm just going to pull out a new viewport and set this to our render result so I can see what's going on. Then the first node I'm going to add in is a glare node, which is going to give the highlights of our image a nice sparkle. So you can tweak these parameters to your liking, but I tend to just use the streak setting and then turn the threshold up to 20 with the angle offset set to about 45 degrees. Then next, I'm going to add in a lens distortion node, which is going to give us this cool kind of 3D chromatic aberration effect. So I'm just going to set the dispersion value to something quite low, like 0.03, as I only want it to be quite subtle. From here, we can just come across to our output settings and then set the folder location and file type, which in my case is MP4, before then hitting the render animation button. And then hopefully if you've been following along, you'll end up with something kinda resembling this. But as I said guys, it's totally up to your own creative limits here. Don't feel restricted to the same colors and materials I've chosen, as you can really take the techniques we've covered in this video and use them to achieve whatever aesthetic resonates most with you and your style. And just to demonstrate this even further, I went ahead and freestyled a bit myself after my original creation just to see if I could take my design in a bit of a different direction. So I just started off by adding in a new cylinder object for my backdrop to see what having a more three-dimensional scene would feel like. I then added in a couple of area lights before then starting to play around with some different materiality for the type. Next, I started tweaking the positions of the letters forwards and backwards from the camera to add a bit more shadow and depth to the scene. I then changed the profile of our extrusion curve so the type would be less sharp and take on a more rounded, organic shape, like so. After that, I experimented by adding in this kind of pseudo pond at the base of my type. And once I did that, I realized I was getting a sort of surrealist aesthetic happening a bit. So I decided to just roll with that and began adding in some random objects like spheres and rocks, in addition to inserting a lot more color into my scene through both the materials and lighting. And that's really about it. I just kept messing around with it till I was happy with it, and then just added in some simple rotating and path animations like we did earlier. So then now that we have a couple of different rendered looks or styles to play around with, we can take these over into Photoshop and begin experimenting with how this might look in other graphic mediums, such as album artwork or poster designs. So the best method to do this is to set up a base Photoshop file for your artwork, which you can then import as a link to other documents by using the Place Linked option. So this is really great because it'll allow you to integrate your artwork into documents with different layout formats or page sizes and so on. And then because it's linked, whenever you update or save over your original artwork file, it will update live in all the associated documents, like so. And then from here, we can start to do things like change the blending mode of our artwork, which will make it integrate over the top of whatever texture we have beneath it. So for example here, I have this simple faded black poster texture underneath, and then if we just go ahead and change the blending mode on our artwork layer from normal to screen, you can now see we're getting this really realistic, gritty looking printout version of our poster. So we can also do the same here on things like album artwork and so on. So feel free to create these from scratch guys, depending on the particular format you're looking to experiment with. But as I said earlier, I've made a new Chrometype starter pack available on my Gumroad for just $10. And this includes a whole bunch of template Photoshop files in a variety of different mediums, including the ones I've just been over, as well as all the associated fonts. And it'll also include all the finished Blender project files we went over in this video, so you'll be able to interrogate my scenes further and have all the materials etc. ready to go. So I'll link that in the description down below for anyone who might be interested. Other than that, thanks for watching guys, and I hope you found this video useful. And if you did, feel free to give me a glow up on the YouTube algorithm by dropping a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing. Cheers.